Hey people, so before I get into this one, just a very quick word on Boris Johnson. I know it's got nothing to do with the video, so if you want to watch the content for that reason, please bear with me. I'll make this brief. Um, Johnson visited Ukraine, and obviously the situation there is tensing up. Um, there were a number of people, journalists and others, asking about his credibility with these Partygate allegations ongoing. I've said that I think Boris Johnson needs to resign, but I also believe I have a certain take on this. I think that when a leader is conducting international diplomacy, it serves no one to disparage that leader unless it's really, botched. Because, if I think it's legitimate for us as British citizens to call for the Prime Minister's resignation, but I don't really see the purpose in denigrating him on international trips like that, because all that does is play into the hands of Putin. So that's my take. Of course, it shouldn't be a distraction from Johnson's domestic problems, but I just don't think we should denigrate um, the Prime Minister in that context. Okay, so well, I was gonna say okay, so WWE. Okay, so I want to talk about professional wrestling, but for me, a lot of that is WWE because it's what I have followed mostly. This is a video I've been planning to make for some time actually, but I wasn't quite sure about the angle because there's a lot to say about it. And I am going to keep it quite condensed and not go into huge details. Wrestling for me, like boxing, is something I've followed for a very long time, but I've kind of went through phases. So, in the late 90s, early 2000s, I was really into wrestling, specifically WWE. Then for quite a long time, I went off it because I was following boxing more. And then in the last sort of, I'd say 2 or 3 years, I've got back into wrestling again. Um, not, I wouldn't say I'm a super fan. I've never been to a wrestling event, so it's entirely, from online basically. So I'm not a super fan. I say I've never been to a wrestling event. That's not entirely true. When I was young, my dad took me and my brother to a wrestling show. I don't know what promotion that was, but I vaguely remember seeing some well-known wrestlers there. I think the Big Boss Man was there. Um, but it's just a vague memory. I can't. I think they were touring in Northern Ireland. I don't remember the details. I don't know what promotion it was, etc. Um, Now, for those who don't follow professional wrestling, there's a few things to comment on. Wrestling obviously has an ancient history. There's different styles and different cultures around the world. Olympic style is based on Greco-Roman wrestling, which is about submissions and pins, but it's not so much about the show. It's more of a grappling form of wrestling. With WWE, which is the world's biggest wrestling promotion, it's very much about entertainment. So much so that Vince McMahon, the CEO of the WWE, actually prefers that wrestlers don't call themselves professional wrestlers, but I believe the term is sports entertainers. Such is the mantra of that aspect of it. Um, Now, WWE is a very powerful organization. It generates many millions, if not billions, in revenue every year from merchandise, from broadcasting, from all sorts of things. It is a major, major form of entertainment. And that is the first thing to consider with professional wrestling. Um, Boxing is an entertainment in a different way, but it's a totally different sport. I follow both, so I'm at a somewhat of a vantage point to sort of look at both in comparison. An interesting note is the actor Mickey Rourke when he played the award-winning role of the wrestler Randy the Ram was the character he played. He actually was unsure about that because he came from a boxing background. He'd actually been an amateur boxer, and he said he'd always looked down on wrestling because it wasn't real. But then he grew respect when he started learning what it actually involved. And this is perhaps a very important thing in the world of wrestling, but which perhaps outsiders need to understand. Yes, it's scripted. In wrestling terminology, kayfabe storylines. it is scripted in a way that boxing obviously isn't. So in that sense, it's not an authentic fight. However, that doesn't take away from the very real athleticism and the very real risks involved. Um, Basically, wrestlers can be seen, I would look at it this way, as professional stuntmen and stuntwomen who, unlike stuntmen and stuntwomen in the films, are in the limelight. So it's a very unique endeavor. And the amount of physical demand that it takes, I would say also mental demand, this is something that's perhaps underestimated in the wrestling world. Certainly that's true in the boxing world, but in the wrestling world as well. Because there's a lot of background politics that goes on. Now, I've been watching a channel called WrestleLamia. It's kind of a play on WrestleMania. Um, and they have a lot of content, a lot of very interesting videos. Things like, for example, I've just watched one top 10 reasons why wrestlers didn't get a push. A push basically means when they are kind of promoted into more of a draw, more of a more of a focus in that whole world of wrestling storylines. Um, and honestly, it takes guts to be a wrestler because the amount of politics that goes on behind the scenes, it's astonishing. You really, really have to play your cards right uh, as a professional wrestler because obviously there's the physical demands. These people do some incredible stunts, some more dangerous than others. Some have been banned for that reason. Um, so there's that obvious physical side of it. And it is true that the average wrestler is quite a picking of male wrestlers, they're quite a big guy, right? I'd make this analogy. A medium or average sized wrestler is like a heavyweight boxer. Someone like Matt Hardy, for example, if he was a boxer, he would be a heavyweight boxer. But in the world of wrestling, he's kind of an average sized guy. That's just to kind of give an indication of what the aesthetics of it are. This is not to say that guys who are smaller can't go far, because there are examples of that. I think it's fair to say that there is a culture within wrestling, and this was especially true in the 80s, where big was good. And by big, I'm talking about muscles, not necessarily big overweight. Actually, an interesting thing was in Britain in the 70s, wrestling was immensely popular, more so than boxing, more so than I realized. Apparently, it would regularly get audiences, television audiences of 10 million, which, when you consider at that time, Britain probably had a population of 50 million, was a huge, huge draw. Um, so, a little bit about the history of how I watch it. I kind of divide wrestling into three eras. There's more than that. But for me, I kind of look at three eras from what I look at. There is the traditional era, pioneers, but the truth is, people like Bruno Sammartino and so on, talented as they were, that was the period before wrestling really became very mainstream with the explosion of WWE. Wasn't them, was WWF, WWF actually in the late 70s and 80s. And then at that time, you had Hulk Hogan, you had Randy Savage, people like that who really, and there were others, Roddy Piper, um, and others, who really, British Bulldog, who really, really exploded its popularity. And it was all about show. It was all about, these larger than life characters. And Hulk Hogan was, I think it's fair to say, one of the biggest celebrities of the 80s. He enjoyed enormous popularity, enormous success. He's still a legend in the wrestling world. Um, and that was like an indicator of where wrestling was going. So it really exploded into mainstream popularity. That's perhaps the difference with boxing. With boxing, you had, for example, just as an indicator, at the turn of the last century, there were fights that drew 100,000 people. So boxing always had ups and downs of periods where it was very popular. Wrestling only really became very mainstream, I would say, from the 80s onwards. Before that, it was like there were in-house shows, but it wasn't really, unless I'm mistaken, it didn't have the same sort of draw. as it does today. So that was that first era, the sort of classic or golden era, as I would see it. Then when I started really getting into it, the era I grew up with essentially is known as the Attitude Era, so called because it was quite, the storylines were quite robust. It was all about, it was a little bit more adult content than usual. But that's basically the era I remember. That's the one I grew up in, sort of late 90s, early 2000s. So that era had some great, great wrestlers. Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Rock, who now is one of the most famous people in the world as Dwayne Johnson. Undertaker, Kane, um, Hart Brothers, the Dudley Boys, the Hardy Boys, Triple H. You know, anyone who follows wrestling will know what I'm talking about. I don't need to preach to the converted, but that era is something that really resonates with me. And then what happened was around the mid 2000s, they sort of trailed off. There wasn't any particular reason. I think at that time I got more into boxing. I thought, oh, wrestling's for kids, which I was wrong about. That's not accurate to say that because, well, I'll come back to that in a minute, but I did trail off. Then around sort of the late 2010s, so it was quite a long hiatus, probably over a decade. Around the late 2010s, I started getting into it again. No particular reason. I just Yeah, no particular reason. I just thought, well, I might follow this again. And I did. And then I started, I tend to associate people like, rightly or wrongly, Roman Reigns, of course, Daniel Bryan, Braun Strowman, um, and I'm sure there's many others. But the era I am most familiar with is the Attitude Era. Now, what I call a crossover period, and there's wrestlers who've kind of crossed over different eras where they kind of made their breakthrough in one era and they've survived in the business and they're big in another era. John Cena is a good example of this. Batista probably another example. Undertaker's been around for 3 decades. This is very, very loosely speaking. Now, WWE, by the way, they changed their name. A lot of what I'm saying here is kind of, excuse me, I've got hiccups. A lot of what I'm saying here is for the benefit of people who don't follow wrestling, just to understand the terminology. WWE, World Wrestling Entertainment, it consolidated all the wrestling federations across North America, and it actually changed its name because the wildlife charity, the World Wildlife Fund, threatened legal action, I understand, in about 1999. So it was WWF, now WWE. I've got an old recording from the Attitude Era, and I think it was still WWF back then. Um, but I find that with wrestling, there's two sides to it. On one side, there's that public image, which is very entertaining. It's all about showbiz. It's all these larger than life characters, and it is very entertaining. The characters can be entertaining. The setups can be entertaining. I mean, one of my favorite events is the Royal Rumble. I've always liked that. Basically, the idea is every minute a wrestler appears in the ring and then they either get thrown out or they don't. Of course, it's all pre scripted, but that doesn't take away the energy from the crowd when a particularly popular wrestler appears. Um, I will say this, wrestling crowds, a bit like boxing crowds, can be fickle, by which I mean um, they can be quite merciless in what they like and don't like. An example of this is Roman Reigns. Now, he's popular now, and he was popular in the beginning, but there was a substantial period when the WWE tried to promote him as the face of the company, as the baby face or the good guy in wrestling terms, and that didn't go down well. Now, Reigns got, openly booed, and I always felt that's really unfortunate. Like, I couldn't understand that because as a non-hardcore wrestling fan, I always thought, well, he seems like a nice guy. He seems, he clearly has talent. I just couldn't understand the hostility. Um, I sort of saw Roman Reigns as the Rock of this era, rightly or wrongly. That's how I saw it. And incidentally, he's a cousin of Dwayne Johnson. I understand, but wrestling fans. especially those who it's almost like people who get really really invested in Comic Con. They're diehard in their loyalty, and as such I guess they expect to be honored in terms of what they want. So fans who don't like a particular storyline, they will let it be known. I mean, it's all theater and performance, and you know the politics that go on behind the scenes. If you look at WrestleMania, it really does take, I think, a lot of assertiveness to be a professional wrestler in the WWE. I'm not talking so much about other promotions simply because I'm not that familiar with them, ECW, and so on. By the way, WWE is pretty tame as wrestling goes in this era. The Attitude Era, there was a character called Mankind. He was one of the other big stars of that era, and he had a Mr. Sock gimmick, which was covered in barbed wire, and it was like he'd stuff it into the opponent's mouth. And that was a bit more raw edged. But when you look at certain Japanese forms of wrestling, it is pretty extreme. You get guys like whacking glass cylinders off each other, and it is very bloody, and that's real. In North American professional wrestling, there used to be a thing about blading, and this is featured in The Wrestler, where wrestlers would deliberately cut themselves just to make it look more effective. But then that got cleaned up in the so-called PG era after the Attitude Era, which was sort of polarized fans. Some fans thought it was boring, it didn't go down well. Others thought it was a good business move. Um, but compared to even more extreme wrestling in North America, I mean, there's some crazy, crazy things go on. I saw one particular form of extreme wrestling. It's on YouTube where guys were getting basically like stunt type things hammered into their head. This this is insanity. This is absolute insanity. And one guy needed it to be kind of brought out. I guess it was like the nails were such that they penetrate the bone but not the brain. I mean, yeah, it's you couldn't make this stuff up. It's you can see this online. It's just crazy, extreme violence. So when you look at WWE by comparison, it's pretty tame. But that doesn't mean that the risks aren't there. Um, and there is a dark side to wrestling. For wrestling fans, obviously there's the situation with, and it's almost like a subject that won't be spoken about. But I'll mention it here for context. There was a wrestler called Chris Benoit, and already I can hear WWE fans gasping. But just for the benefit of outsiders, basically he was a fairly popular wrestler, pretty skilled wrestler. He wasn't the biggest guy around, but he was pretty skilled wrestler. And he was sort of middle ground. He wasn't one of the top stars, but he was pretty popular. Anyway, he ended up in a murder suicide situation, and there was a lot of uncertainty at the time about what exactly had transpired. In the wrestling world, that is a very, very taboo issue because it brought in all sorts of debate about performance enhancing drugs, so called roid rage, and this, provoked fierce debate about what had actually happened. But when that was analysed, it was found that Chris Benoit, he was 40, I believe, 41, 42, but he had the brain of a man in his 80s. So it was believed that this was his particular move in wrestling, which was a sort of this diving bomb move. I forget the exact name of it. Like I say, and I have to keep emphasizing this, I'm not a hardcore wrestling fan, so I'm not going to pretend I know all the terminology. But that move then got kind of assigned to history because WWE didn't want to take the risks. There's another thing about professional wrestling, which is that the number of professional wrestlers who have died young, or let's say before the age of 60, is shocking, absolutely shocking. And I don't think any other sport compares. Not boxing, not American football. Um, it's shocking. There's an entire Wikipedia article based on this, and some of that's even been recently. So I do think there is a dark side to the sport, and I think it's almost like wrestlers are almost like circus performers because they're on the road a lot of the time. It's a very grueling lifestyle. I suspect most of them do it. They put up with this because they love They love what they do. I mean, I can't think of any rational reason why anyone would put themselves through that. It's physically grueling. It's a bit like being a rock star on a tour. Um, but then there's the background politics. You know, you can have the look, and there's a lot of wrestlers that have looked the part, like they've got the physique, they're pretty skilled, but they still haven't went very far. And I think this shows how precarious that whole world can be, because if you don't win over the fans, if you don't win over management, then unfortunately, even if you have the look, you're not going to go far. Mic skills is very important. You know, the whole thing about cutting a promo, being able to trash talk your opponent. In boxing, that's shunned, but in wrestling, it's almost a prerequisite because it's theatre, it's entertainment, it's performance art. And wrestlers who are good on the mic, guys like John Cena, go very far. Um, I was looking at a list of, I think it was Ranker or something like that, the 30 most greatest wrestlers of all time in their opinion, and they looked at several criteria in ring skills, look, promo, all those things. So a wrestler that could do all those things in theory should do quite well. But when you have to balance all those things, plus the politics in the background of having to sort of go through management storylines, I mean, if you're a jobber, if you're starting off, you basically you're a tool of Vince McMahon and management. So if he says, okay, you're going to dress up like a chicken as part of your gimmick, basically they have to do it. And I think that would take an enormous amount of willpower and patience to sort of accept that it's part of the game. Um, if you're going in a certain direction and then management says you want to go in another direction, at that early stage, I guess it's like anything in life. When actors starting off has to sort of give what take what they're given, so to speak. Same in wrestling, but with wrestling you have the added dimension of the lifestyle, which is very grueling. WWE has a wellness program on drugs. I think, to be fair, they probably have made conscious efforts to clean up, but there's no getting away from the fact that for professional wrestlers, it is a very grueling lifestyle. And I think, sometimes the fans forget that they're human beings. Behind all of the makeup, behind all of the razzmatazz, all of that, they're human beings. And it's something that needs to be remembered. Um, But I think that wrestling is great escapism. Sometimes it's a bit silly. Some of the storylines, incidentally, I'm not a fan of. I think they could be a bit crude and a bit just ridiculous. And certainly Vince McMahon in the WWE has been guilty of pushing taboo storylines just for ratings, which is kind of cynical. Sometimes, they haven't been shy of using racial angles or inappropriate, relationship angles, and sometimes it's kind of in bad taste, but more often than not, it really is just escapism and entertainment. So that having been said, I'm probably going to go to a wrestling video now. Anyway, that's just my take. I definitely see the appeal with professional wrestling. If you don't know anything about it, maybe check out a Royal Rumble. That's a good introduction, in my opinion. Um, there's a lot of other formatted wrestling matches. There's Hell in a Cell. There's Money in the Bank. Some of these might be redundant now, I don't know. Um, but basically, if you want to get into this, I would recommend Royal Rumble, because generally it's almost like a token system, that you get picked to be in a Royal Rumble. It's always a good introduction, I think, for a wrestler. Then you start to see individual matches, and some have bigger draws than others. It's even an average wrestler, if they get to the WWE, they could get a significant degree of fame. And the top wrestlers, I think it's fair to say they're some of the biggest celebrities around. They're up there with the top singers and the top actors. It can get considerable fame. If you look at wrestling videos, they get millions and millions of views. So even an average wrestler in the roster, that is the number of wrestlers at a particular time, um, it does attract a lot of attention. So it's a whole world of entertainment. Incidentally, I know a professional wrestler, although I haven't been in touch with her for years. Woman wrestler. She was interested in it when we went to youth club together years ago, and she's actually got into some promotions, not WWE, but she seems to be doing quite well. So I've lost touch with her for years. Her name's Sarah Jones. So if you follow wrestling, you might know that name. She's billed from Newcastle, but I hope she goes far. From what I've seen, her in-ring work is very good, and she's very good at promos and so on. Yeah, the whole world of wrestling, it's larger than life. It's escapism. It's more often than not pretty silly. But I think fans need to respect what wrestlers go through. And it is quite a ruthless world in terms of getting there, like anything. I mean, I watched an event on NXT, which is one of the brands of WWE, and it was like these guys were on mics, and the whole thing was cutting a promo. And, I couldn't help feeling sorry for those who couldn't make it through. Did you know that they're not going to be promoted much further than that? And the wrestling career is basically, if not at an end, it's going to be hard to get much further than that. So I can't help, from a human perspective, have some sympathy. But I suppose it's like anything, it's competitive. Not everyone can get to the top. I do think that some shady things go on in the background. I think, for example, the way WWE pushes a wrestler to have a certain style or a certain kayfabe, and then they basically penalize them if it doesn't go down well with fans when they have pushed them to do it in the first place. That's ridiculous. So I think that wrestlers need to look out for other wrestlers a bit more. There needs to be probably WWE's improved to be fair, but I'd say there are probably some shady things that go on in the background. And wrestling, like boxing, has had its share of scandals. An example of this is 1997, I believe it was, the so-called Montreal Screwjob. Two of the most popular wrestlers of that time, Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels, were involved in what was considered to be a fixed match. And Bret Hart, who's a Canadian icon, felt that he got the raw end of the deal and he let his feelings be known. And it was a huge scandal in the world of wrestling, the Montreal Screwjob. Anyway, check out anything to do with WWE. Of course, if you're new to it, all the names will be alien to you, but over time you'll start to realize like the gimmicks, even theme tunes. You could type in a wrestler's theme tune. I don't think they choose their own theme tune, but some are quite memorable, particularly in the Attitude Era. Um, and wrestlers can, certainly in the case of Dwayne Johnson, he's now one of the most famous people in the world. He's been immensely successful in the film industry as well. So it can really let people go far. Um, but just look at interviews with successful wrestlers. Someone like Chris Jericho, again, he's I would say someone who transitioned from one era to another. I mean, there's many wrestlers here I haven't even named. But I think it is a very, very, very demanding sport. And, I take my hat off to anyone who can make it that far because it takes certainly physical toughness, but mental toughness as well. Personally, if I wanted to get into that world, I think I'd be content being sort of middle build wrestler. I think I'd be content with not being at the very top, but at least getting some attention. Um, but the pressure must be, I think that is a major sacrifice. And so for that reason, I think a lot of wrestlers maybe don't have very stable family lives in that sense. I think it's hard to settle down because they're always on the road. So who knows? Um, yeah. Okay, let me know your thoughts if you're a WWE fan. If I've got any terminology wrong, please correct me. If you've any questions, if you don't know anything about wrestling, I'll try to answer as much as I can. But check it out. I mean, it's great escapism.